Hello everyone. Welcome to the channel, where crime meets comfort and mysteries unfold while you go for the sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you from and what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. I'm always curious to see who's joining me on these late night adventures. Now let's begin the story. I had lived in Ironwood my entire life. Before the eviction notices, before the police trucks, before the headlines turned our neighborhood into a battleground, it was home. Not perfect, not safe by any stretch, but it was ours. My mother moved, here in the late 80s when the rent was cheap and people looked out for each other. The corner store owner knew your name. Kids rode their bikes up and down the cracked sidewalks. We weren't wealthy, but we had roots. Generations of families lived in the same buildings, passed down like heirlooms. Then the city changed. The old warehouses turned into high-rise condos. Coffee shops that charged $6 for a latte replaced the taquerias. The landlords saw dollar signs where we saw our childhoods. Rent doubled, then tripled. The new people moved in. Tech workers, developers, people who saw Ironwood as up and coming, like we hadn't been here all along. And then the eviction notices came. Ours, arrived in early July, slipped under the door like an afterthought. A polite letter from some investment firm I had never heard of, telling us we had 30 days to vacate. No negotiation, no relocation plan, just a promise that if we weren't gone, we'd be removed. Some of my neighbors left, forced into shelters, or packed into distant relatives' homes. But for the rest of us, leaving wasn't an option. Where were we supposed to go? The city had no answers. The government didn't care, and so we stayed. We met in stairwells and empty lots, organizing, trying to fight back. We called lawyers, reached out to the media, begged the city council to intervene. But the developers had money, and money always won. Then on August 18th, the police came. Not a few officers with eviction notices, hundreds of them, dressed in riot gear. Armored trucks rolling through the streets like we were a war zone. Helicopters overhead. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to clear us out. That morning I stood by the window of our third-floor apartment, watching the police line up outside. My mother clutched my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin. "Stay inside," she whispered. But I already knew. There was no hiding from what was coming. I stood at the window, my breath fogging up the glass. Outside, the street was flooded with police. Their riot shields formed an unbroken wall, black helmets reflecting the dull morning light. Behind them, armored trucks idled, their engines growling like caged animals. It wasn't just a routine eviction. It was an invasion. From the apartment above, a woman screamed, the sound sharp and panicked. A child was crying somewhere down the hall. My mother gripped my wrist tighter. "Stay inside," she repeated, her voice shaking now. A deep mechanical voice echoed from a loudspeaker. "This is a court-ordered eviction. You have been given legal notice to vacate. Leave peacefully or face removal." Nobody moved. Down below, on the sidewalk, my neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, stood his ground. He was nearly 70, his hands worn from decades of labor. His wife clutched his arm, but he didn't step back. "This is our home," he shouted. "You can't just take it." A cop moved toward him. Not fast, not aggressive, just a step, hand resting on his baton. A warning. Mr. Alvarez didn't budge. Then someone threw a bottle. It wasn't from our building, I was sure of that. But the moment it shattered against a riot shield, everything changed. The line broke. Police surged. Forward, shields up, batons raised. The crowd panicked. I saw people running, pushing, screaming. Flashbangs exploded on the pavement, bursts of light and sound rattling the air. A woman collapsed, clutching her face. Someone else was coughing violently, staggering backward. Pepper spray. I backed, away from the window. "We have to go," I told my mother. She shook her head. "Where?" It was the question none of us had an answer to. The front doors of the complex burst open as officers flooded in. I could hear them shouting, boots pounding against the stairs. A crash from the hallway. Someone had kicked in a door. Not ours. Not yet. We weren't going to make it out. My mother grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to look at her. No matter what happens, you stay with me. Do you hear me? I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then our door burst open and the world went white with noise. The door exploded inward, slamming against the wall so hard the plaster cracked. My mother screamed, instinctively pulling me behind her as uniformed officers flooded into our apartment. The air reeked of sweat, metal, and something acrid. Pepper. Spray. Hands up, one of them shouted. My body locked up, but my mother didn't move. We have nowhere to go, she shouted back. You're throwing us onto the street. They didn't care. One officer grabbed her arm and wrenched her forward. She stumbled, nearly falling. Get your hands off her, I yelled, stepping between them, but I barely got the words out before someone shoved me back so hard I hit the set floor. My ears rang from the impact, but I could still hear the chaos outside. Shouts, glass breaking, sirens wailing. Somewhere in the building, people were still fighting, still resisting, but it was useless. They had planned this. They had already won. Through the open doorway, I saw Mr. Alvarez and his wife being dragged out of their apartment. His face was red, his eyes watering, but he still had enough strength to spit at the ground near an officer's boot. You'll never own this place, he rasped. The officer barely spared him a glance before shoving him forward. This wasn't just an eviction, it was a message. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. Let us leave on our own, I begged. You don't have to. Shut up, one of them snapped, pushing us toward the door. We were funneled down the stairs like cattle, past shattered door frames and scattered belongings. Toys, clothes, family photographs littered the hallway. People were crying, screaming, begging for mercy that wasn't coming. As we stepped outside, the sun was blinding. The street was in ruins, overturned furniture, broken windows, scorch marks from the flashbangs. Residents huddled together, some bleeding, some coughing from the gas. The air felt thick with anger, fear, and something worse. Defeat. I spotted one of my friends, Malik, a few feet away. He was holding his little sister, his lips split open. They hit her, he said numbly when he saw me. She's 7. I had no words. Behind us, a wrecking crew was already moving in. The building we had called home for years, the one we had fought for, was about to be torn apart. Because that was the real goal, wasn't it? Not just to remove us, to erase us, to make it seem like we were never here at all. We stood in the middle of the street, dazed and shaking as the demolition crew moved in. A bulldozer rumbled past us, its massive treads grinding against the pavement. The Ironwood complex, our home, was about to be reduced to rubble. Just like that. Like it had never existed. Like we had never existed. A deep metallic groan echoed through the air as the first wrecking ball swung forward, shattering the second-floor windows. Glass and debris rained down onto the sidewalk. People screamed, but no one stopped it. The police had done their job. We were out. Now it was time to erase the evidence that we had ever been here. I turned to my mother. Where do we go? She didn't answer. Her hands trembled as she clutched the plastic bag holding what little she'd managed to grab. Her purse, some papers, my grandmother's old locket. That was all we had left. I looked around. The crowd of displaced residents had begun to scatter. Some wandered aimlessly. Others made frantic calls to relatives. A few still stood frozen, watching their homes collapse in slow motion. A woman sobbed into her hands. A father held his crying daughter, murmuring reassurances he couldn't possibly believe. Malik appeared beside me, holding his little sister's hand so tightly her fingers were turning red. My aunt lives in Richmond, he said, his voice hollow. We can stay with her. Maybe. Maybe. That's what we all had now. Maybes. I pulled out my phone, but the battery was nearly dead. No service either. Too many people trying to call at once. The cops were still nearby, watching from behind their riot shields, making sure we stayed out. One of them, helmet off, face blank, met my gaze. There was no apology in his eyes. No regret, just boredom. like he was already thinking about his next assignment. I clenched my jaw, my fists. For a second, I thought about running at him, screaming, fighting. But what would that change? They had already taken everything. My mother finally spoke, her voice small. "There's a shelter downtown." My stomach dropped. "A shelter?" She nodded, barely looking at me. "Just for tonight, until we figure something out." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her we weren't homeless, that this was just a mistake, that someone would fix it, but there was nothing left to fix. Ironwood was gone, and we had nowhere to go. We walked. Not because we wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The Ironwood district wasn't ours anymore. The police made sure of that, standing in loose formations at the edge of the street, shields still up, watching as if we were criminals, as if we might try to run back inside the ruins of our homes and reclaim them. So we walked. My mother gripped my wrist like she was afraid I'd disappear. Around us, the others moved in broken clusters, families with duffel bags slung over their shoulders, elderly neighbors leaning on canes, children too tired to cry anymore. A few people tried calling relatives, but most of us knew the truth. There was no one coming to save us. A siren wailed in the distance. Another eviction somewhere else? Another neighborhood being erased? We didn't talk as we walked through the city. The Ironwood district had been ours, but the moment we crossed into wealthier streets, the world changed. No one looked at us. No one stopped to ask what had happened. To them, we were just another part of the city's background noise. By the time we reached the shelter, the sun was setting. The place was packed, mattresses lined up wall to wall, folding chairs scattered between makeshift living spaces. The air smelled like sweat and microwaved food. It wasn't home. It wasn't even close. A woman at the front desk looked up, exhausted. "How many?" "2," my mother said, voice barely above a whisper. She nodded and handed over 2 blankets. "Find a spot. We're at capacity, but we'll figure something out." We squeezed into an empty corner. The floor was hard, the walls scuffed and covered in peeling paint. Someone coughed. A baby cried. Somewhere, a man muttered to himself, rocking in place. I pulled my knees to my chest. Less than 12 hours ago, I had a home, a bed, a life. Now, I had a scratchy blanket and the weight of everything we had lost pressing down on me. My mother sat beside me, staring at nothing. I wanted to tell her we'd be okay, that we'd find a way out of this, that we'd rebuild, but I didn't, because I didn't know if that was true. Outside, the city lights glowed, cars rushed past, people laughed in restaurants, life moved on. For everyone except us, we had been erased, and no one even noticed. I had been in the game long enough to know that a job like this wasn't just about skill. It was about patience, the kind of patience that made you sit for months, studying blueprints, learning security schedules, watching every little habit of the people inside. The Melbourne Diamond Exchange wasn't just any jewelry shop. It was the beating heart of the city's diamond trade, where millions of dollars in gems changed hands daily, a place built to withstand criminals like me. But nothing was invincible. We had been planning the heist since August 2022, 6 of us, all professionals, each with a specialty. We weren't thugs breaking into liquor stores. We were a syndicate, an operation with backing, with resources. Some of us had done time, others had records so clean they could pass a government check. That was the key. A good crew needed balance. Our inside man was a locksmith, a quiet guy who had spent years working maintenance for commercial buildings. No one ever suspected the guy who fixed the doors. He had access to security panels, blueprints, and most importantly, knowledge of the weak points. The alarm system? State of the art, but everything had a blind spot. We knew where they were. The vault? Top tier, but not impenetrable. Pressure-sensitive locks, reinforced steel, biometric scans. But we had a way in. It was all about timing. December 10th, 2022. That was the night. The exchange was always quiet on Saturdays. Employees left early, the security guards relied too much on automation, and the city's attention was on holiday shopping and summer celebrations. We moved just past midnight. Dressed as maintenance workers, we entered through a service entrance. We knew had a camera with a 12-second delay. That was all we needed. The moment we stepped inside, everything became mechanical. No room for nerves, no second guessing. The system had already been disabled from the inside thanks to our locksmith. Step 1. Control the room. The night crew, 2 employees and a guard, were caught off guard. No weapons, no violence. Just a few words, a show of force, and the kind of presence that made people listen. Step 2. The vault. The codes were changed daily, but fear was a powerful motivator. They opened it. They always did. Inside, trays of diamonds and rare gems glittered under the artificial lights. Step 3. Extraction. We were in and out in under 20 minutes. As we vanished into the night, carrying millions in stolen gems, I knew one thing. This wasn't just another job. This was history. The moment we stepped out of the Melbourne Diamond Exchange, we weren't thieves anymore. We were ghosts. No sirens, no alarms. Just the hum of the city around us, completely unaware of what had just happened. The job had been smooth, but it wasn't over. The hardest part of a heist wasn't getting in, it was getting away. And Melbourne wasn't a city that let you just disappear. We split up immediately. That was the plan. No getaway van, no dramatic high-speed chase. Each of us had a separate route, a separate destination. If one of us got caught, the others would keep moving. I took the alleyway behind the exchange, walking like I had every right to be there. My coveralls were stained with grease, a fake ID badge clipped to my chest. Just another maintenance worker finishing a late shift. The diamonds were in a reinforced courier bag, strapped tight to my back. No loose pockets, no jangling. Just a few $1 million worth of gems resting against my spine. A block away, I saw one of our guys, Felix, slipping into an unmarked sedan. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. He drove off slow and steady, just another commuter heading home. I turned onto Collins Street, heading toward a construction site we had scoped out months earlier. There was a reason I chose this route. No cameras, no security patrols, just a half-built office tower with plenty of dark corners. Inside, I peeled off my coveralls, stuffing them into a bag already waiting for me. Beneath them, I wore a plain black hoodie and jeans. My boots switched for a different pair. Every detail mattered. By the time I stepped back onto the street, I wasn't the same man who had walked into that building 15 minutes earlier. I was just another face in the crowd. Across the city, the others were doing the same, shedding their old skins, becoming different people. We had planned this to the second. I checked my phone. A single text from a burner number. Clean. The final signal. The job was done. Now came the waiting. In the movies, heists end the moment you make it out. In reality, the days after are the most dangerous because the police weren't stupid, and they were about to come down on this city like a hammer. By sunrise, the heist was all over the news. Melbourne Diamond Exchange hit by sophisticated robbery. Millions stolen. No signs of forced entry. Police suspect inside help. Was this Australia's most perfect heist? I sat in a dingy motel room on the city's outskirts, curtains drawn, TV volume low. My phone vibrated every few minutes, burner numbers sending coded messages. The others were checking in, making sure no one had been picked up. So far, we were ghosts. But ghosts don't stay invisible forever. By noon, the police had locked down the Diamond Exchange. The forensic teams were combing the scene, trying to piece together how we got in, how we bypassed the security. They would find clues. Sure. But we had been careful. No fingerprints. No DNA. No security footage. Still, I knew better than to feel safe. Because when the police don't have immediate answers, they start shaking the tree. And sometimes, people fall out. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the first crack appeared. A news anchor on TV. Authorities believe the robbery was carried out by a highly skilled team with ties to international crime syndicates. Sources say federal agencies may become involved. I clenched my jaw. This wasn't supposed to go beyond Melbourne PD. But now they were bringing in the big players, people with the resources to dig deeper, to apply pressure where it hurt, and then came the second problem. Felix. He was supposed to be in Sydney by now, lying low, blending in. Instead, he was still in Melbourne. Worse, he had been seen. A security camera near a train station had caught a blurry image of someone matching his description, wearing the same shoes he had on the night of the heist. Not enough to arrest him, but enough to make him a suspect. Grabbed my phone, texting a secure number. "What the hell are you still doing here?" No response. That's when I knew. Felix was panicking, and panicked people make mistakes. That night, the police made their first move. They raided a known safe house in Footscray, kicking down doors, dragging out anyone with a connection to Melbourne's underworld. They were desperate for leads, and they weren't being gentle about it. I stayed put, barely breathing, waiting for another text, another update. Finally, my phone vibrated. Felix picked up. He's talking. My stomach dropped. The job wasn't over. It was about to get a whole lot messier. Felix had always been the weak link. We brought him in because he was useful, good with logistics, reliable under pressure, but he was never built for the long game. The moment things got hot, I knew he'd crack, and now he was in police custody. Talking. I paced the motel room, my mind racing. The others had gone underground, sticking to the plan. New identities, burner phones, cash-only transactions. We were ghosts. Felix, though, he was sitting in a fluorescent-lit room, sweating through his shirt while detectives picked him apart. The news confirmed it an hour later. Breaking. Melbourne Diamond Exchange. Suspect in custody. Authorities say significant progress made. In case. They didn't name him yet, but I didn't need them to. I grabbed my phone and texted one of our guys. "Where is he?" A few minutes later, the reply came. "Police HQ, under protection." Of course. They knew what we'd do to him if we got the chance. Felix wasn't just a suspect now. He was a witness. By midnight, everything was unraveling. Felix had given them something. Details about the planning, safe houses, how we bypassed the vault. Security. Not everything, but enough. The police hit 3 locations that night. One of them was our warehouse in Port Melbourne, the place we were supposed to hold the gems before smuggling them out of the country. I had cleared it earlier that day, but I wasn't sure about the others. Had they left anything behind? A receipt? A fingerprint? A single damn trace? I didn't wait to find out. I packed what little I had left and moved. Motel to motel, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. I switched phones, ditched my car. The noose was tightening. Then, just as I thought I had a shot at slipping away, I saw the footage. Security camera, grainy but clear enough. Me walking into the construction site where I changed clothes after. The heist. They had me. The police just didn't know my name yet. There were 2 choices. Try to run. Find a way out of the country before the police put the last pieces together. Disappear another way. By morning, I made my decision. I dialed a number I hoped I'd never have to use. A deep voice answered. "You're late. I need out." Silence. Then, "We'll see." I hung up knowing what that meant. Help came at a price, and I wasn't sure I'd survive paying it. I left the motel before dawn. No phone, no credit cards, just a burner stuffed in my pocket and a backpack with cash, fake IDs, and whatever I could carry. Melbourne wasn't safe anymore. Felix had already buried me. The police had my face. It was only a matter of time before they had my name. I needed to disappear. I made my way to an old warehouse near the docks, one of our old safe houses, long abandoned. The place smelled like rust and salt water, and the walls were lined with crates full of nothing but dust and rotting wood. At exactly 6 a.m., a black SUV pulled up outside. 2 men stepped out. I recognized them immediately. Not cops. Worse, they worked for him, the crime boss who had financed our heist, the one who had expected a clean job, a perfect job. No heat, no arrests. And now, thanks to Felix, it was anything but clean. I knew the rules. Felix talked. That meant loose ends had to be tied up, and I was a loose end. One of the men lit a cigarette, took a long drag before exhaling through his nose. "You fucked up," he said, his voice calm. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The other guy stepped forward, a duffel bag in his hands. "You've got two choices," he said. "You take the money, get on a ship, and we never see you again." I glanced at the bag. It wasn't small, enough to start over somewhere, if I could stay ahead of the law. "And if I say no?" I asked. The first man flicked his cigarette onto the ground. "Then we make sure you don't talk either. Simple as that. Run or die." I thought about it, about what running would mean, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the next knock on the door. I thought about Felix sitting in some police station spilling every detail he could to save his own skin. I thought about the diamonds, how they had once felt like freedom. Now they were just a curse. I took the bag, didn't thank them, didn't look back, just walked toward the docks where a cargo ship was waiting. As I climbed aboard, I realized something. I had pulled off the biggest heist Melbourne had ever seen. But in the end, I had stolen nothing. Not really, because the moment I stepped onto that ship, I lost everything, and I would never be able to come home again. The ocean smelled different that morning. Sharp, metallic, like the air before a storm. I was standing on the cliffs when I heard the commotion below. Voices, the crunch of boots against damp sand, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the wind. I made my way down, past the jagged rocks, past the weathered fence that barely held back the sea. That's when I saw her, Eleanor. Face pale, lips parted, eyes empty. Her body lay twisted near the base of the old lighthouse, her dark coat tangled around her like seaweed. Even from a distance, I could see the bruises blooming across her skin, the unnatural angle of her limbs. She hadn't fallen. She had been placed here. The fisherman who found her stood nearby, his hat clenched in his hands, eyes wide with something close to fear. I thought it was just some debris at first," he stammered. "The tide brings all sorts of things in, but when I got closer..." He didn't need to finish. I swallowed hard, forcing my mind to work through the shock. Eleanor Vance. My niece. 19 years old. Too young to die like this. I had reported her missing only hours before. She was supposed to come home last night after the art exhibition, but she never did. I had assumed she lost track of time, maybe stayed with a friend. She was stubborn like that, always chasing her independence. But this wasn't the fate she deserved. The coroner arrived within the hour, his face grim as he examined her. "Blunt force trauma," he muttered, brushing back Eleanor's dark hair to reveal a deep gash on her temple. Multiple broken ribs. Whatever did this wasn't an accident. A uniformed officer crouched nearby, jotting notes. "Any sign of a struggle?" The coroner shook his head. "Strangely, no. No defensive wounds. She didn't fight back." I stared at the body, trying to make sense of it. That wasn't like Eleanor. She would have fought, unless she never saw it coming. Then came the other detail. "The bruising here," the coroner murmured, tracing a series of marks along her ribs. "These aren't from fists. They're too precise, too uniform." The officer frowned. "Like a tool?" The coroner nodded. A chill ran down my spine. Eleanor was last seen walking home alone. But somewhere between that exhibition and this lighthouse, something terrible happened, and I wasn't going to rest until I found out who did it. The town was already talking. By the time Eleanor's body was taken away, whispers had spread from the cliffs to the docks, down the quiet main street, and into the dimly lit bars where fishermen nursed their drinks. Everyone had a theory. Most people pointed fingers at the same man, Silas Reed. He was the town recluse, living alone in a cottage at the edge of the woods, not far from the lighthouse. He had spent decades collecting junk, old tools, rusted farm equipment, things other people threw away. People said he had strange habits, that he watched the town from the tree line, always listening, always waiting. But most importantly, he had history with the Vance family. My brother, Eleanor's father, had once been involved in a land dispute with him, a bitter, drawn-out battle over a stretch of property that never really belonged to either of them. The bad blood never faded. So when Eleanor was found near his side of town, people assumed it wasn't a coincidence. The police wasted no time searching Silas's place. I stood outside the cottage as they tore through it, watching the old man sit on his porch, his hands resting on his knees, staring out at nothing. He looked tired. When the officers finally emerged, their faces were tight with frustration. "Nothing," one of them muttered. "No blood, no clothing, no missing personal items, no specialized tools matching the marks on Eleanor's body." Silas was weird, but he wasn't a killer. Still, I needed to hear it from him. I walked up the steps, the boards creaking beneath my weight. "Did you see Eleanor last night?" Silas turned his head slowly, his eyes like dull glass. "No." "You hear anything? Anyone near the lighthouse?" A pause. Then, "A car. Late. Didn't recognize it." I frowned. "You get a look at the driver?" Silas shook his head. It wasn't much, but it was something. The police left him alone after that. The town would still blame him. People always needed a villain, but I knew the truth. The real killer was still out there. And if Silas was right about that car, then Eleanor never made it home because someone took her. The question was, who and why did they leave her body near the lighthouse like a message waiting to be read? The police moved on from Silas Reed, but I didn't. I sat in my car outside the sheriff's office, watching them go through their usual routine, checking notes, making calls, pretending they had control. But I knew better. They had no suspects, no leads, just a dead girl in a small town full of people desperate to pin the blame on anyone but themselves. So I started asking questions myself. If Eleanor had been taken, someone had to have seen her before that moment. The art exhibition was my first stop. The gallery owner remembered her well, said she was in good spirits, chatting with a few locals, even laughing. But when the event ended, she declined a ride home. She said she wanted to walk, the owner told me, shifting uncomfortably. Said the beach at night helped her think. That was Eleanor, all right. I followed her supposed route in my head. If she left the gallery around 10:30, she'd have walked along the coastline, past the lighthouse, toward our house. But somewhere in that space, somewhere between the event and the cliffs, something happened. Then I got lucky. A waitress at a late-night diner on the edge of town, Cora, came forward. I found her leaning against the counter on her break, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "I don't know if it means anything," she said, "but I saw Eleanor that night. She was here." My stomach tightened. "With who?" Cora hesitated. "3 men. I didn't recognize 2 of them, but the third, I've seen him before, Mr. Caldwell." I stiffened. Caldwell was an antique dealer, a collector. He came into town every so often, always asking about rare finds, old tools, maritime artifacts, things lost to time. He had money, influence. He made people uncomfortable, but no one ever said it out loud. "She looked fine at first," Cora continued. "She was talking like she was interested in what he was saying, but then something changed. I heard a thud, like someone slamming their hand on the table real hard. Then it got quiet. Really quiet. I tried to keep my voice calm. And then they left. Caldwell's car was the last one out of the lot. I think she was with them." I swallowed hard. Eleanor hadn't been alone. She had left with Caldwell and 2 unknown men. And if Cora was right, she never walked that beach by choice. Someone had taken her, and now I had a name. Caldwell. The name sat in my chest like a weight as I drove through town, past shuttered storefronts and rusting fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. I knew of him. Everyone did. But not in the way you know a neighbor or a friend. He was a shadow, a man who came and went, always watching, always hunting for something. I pulled up outside his shop, a dimly lit place crammed between a bookstore and a tailor's shop. The windows were full of strange things, nautical tools, old maps, tarnished silverware, artifacts of forgotten lives. I stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and oil, like something preserved too long. Caldwell sat behind the counter polishing a brass compass. He looked up, and for a moment there was nothing but politeness in his expression. Then recognition flickered in his eyes. "Arthur Vance," he said smoothly, setting down the compass. "What can I do for you?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "You were with Eleanor the night she died." Caldwell didn't blink. "I spoke with her, yes. Lovely girl." I clenched my jaw. "You left the diner together." "She was curious about something I had," he said, tilting his head slightly. "An old ship tool, a rare find. She wanted to see it." I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. "And you took her where?" He exhaled, like I was exhausting him. We drove along the cliffs. I showed her the tool. We talked. She decided to walk home. That was the last I saw her. He was lying. I knew it. He knew I knew it. I scanned the shop, my eyes landing on a glass display case against the back wall. Tools, knives, metal objects with intricate engravings. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw it. A heavy, rusted tool with curved edges. The shape was familiar. I had seen the coroner's report. The strange bruising on Eleanor's ribs, consistent with a specialized tool. The breath left my lungs. This was it. Caldwell followed my gaze and smiled, slow and knowing. "Interesting. Peace, isn't it?" I forced myself to stay calm. "Where'd you get it?" His smile didn't fade. "You'd be surprised what washes up in a place like this." My hands curled into fists. I wanted to reach across the counter and rip the truth from him, but I didn't, because now I knew. He wasn't just a collector, he was a predator, and he wasn't afraid of me. Caldwell's smile stayed fixed, his fingers tapping slowly against the counter. The bastard wasn't just lying, he was enjoying this. I forced myself to breathe. Eleanor never made it home. Caldwell tilted his head, like he was considering the thought for the first time. A tragedy. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears, my fingers twitched at my sides. I wanted to grab that rusted tool from the display case, press it against his throat, and demand answers. But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't getting out of here with force. So I leaned in, lowering my voice. "You were seen at the diner, leaving with her. That's not a tragedy, it's a lead." For a fraction of a second, I saw something in his expression. Something dark. Then it was gone. "You're mistaken." His voice was smooth, controlled. "Eleanor was free to leave whenever she wanted. Then why were you seen driving toward the lighthouse with something large covered in the back of your car?" Silence. The smile was gone now. A long, tense moment passed. Then he exhaled, shaking his head like I was a foolish child. "Arthur, you're letting grief cloud your judgment." I felt my hands shake, but I clenched them into fists, steadying myself. "You hurt her." My voice was barely above a whisper. "And you think you'll get away with it?" Caldwell's eyes darkened. "I already have." He wasn't lying. The police had already made it clear. They had no solid evidence, no real case. Men like Caldwell didn't just commit crimes. They designed them, planned them down to the last detail. He knew how to leave nothing behind. No blood, no fingerprints, no struggle, no one to testify. And I realized in that moment what this was. Not a confession, a warning. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, voice dropping to a near whisper. "This town doesn't care about girls like Eleanor." His tone was almost sympathetic. "You know that, don't you?" I felt my stomach turn. Because he was right. No matter how loud I screamed, how much I fought, there would be no justice. The police wouldn't touch him. The case would stay open, unsolved. A mystery. By the time I left the shop, I could barely feel my hands. Eleanor was gone. And her killer? He was still collecting, still hunting, and no one was going to stop him. The walls of Thorn Academy had always echoed with my father's lessons about legacy. My father, a scholar of the old world, had spent decades molding the academy into an institution that produced not just students, but leaders. He believed in discipline, in tradition, in the quiet, unbreakable dignity of family honor, and I carried that belief like a sacred duty. I was Silas Thorn, headmaster of Thorn Academy, husband to Evelyn, father to 4 remarkable children. I had spent my life upholding the values my father instilled in me. I demanded excellence not just from my students but from my family. The Thorns were not merely people, we were a lineage, a legacy. That legacy was shattered with a single document. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, just a simple folder, unassuming in its plainness. But the words inside dismantled my world in quiet, merciless precision. A discrepancy has been found in the genealogical records regarding the Thorn lineage. I had agreed to contribute my family's history to a prestigious historical society project, never doubting the purity of my bloodline. My father had always emphasized the importance of lineage, of knowing where we came from. But the DNA results, they told another story. My children, weren't mine. Every line, every carefully worded analysis led to the same unthinkable conclusion. The biological father of my children was not Silas Thorn. It was Alistair Thorn. I felt the world shift beneath my feet. The words on the page blurred, the ink bleeding together in a cruel joke. I read them again, my fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. Alistair, my uncle, my estranged uncle, whose presence at the academy was tolerated, not welcomed. A man who had always walked in my shadow, resenting the authority I inherited. He was a brilliant historian, but also a bitter man, one whose arrogance had cost him friendships, whose controversial work often bordered on dangerous revisionism. The implications hit me like a slow-moving avalanche. Had my wife known? Had she known and kept this from me? I confronted Evelyn that very night. She stood in our bedroom, hands trembling as she read the document. A quiet sob slipped past her lips. "Silas," she whispered, shaking her head. My voice was ice. "Tell me the truth." She collapsed onto the bed, her face buried in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was so fragile I barely recognized it. "I never wanted this," she confessed. God, Silas, I never wanted this." I stood rigid, waiting, my heart pounding. "Alistair," she swallowed hard. He forced himself into my life. He controlled me. His influence at the academy, his power over my work. I thought I could escape, but I was trapped. The walls seemed to close in around me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. Tears streamed down her face. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what he would do. Afraid of what you would do." She was right to fear. I wasn't the same man I had been an hour ago. Everything I had built, my family, my name, my place in history, had been corrupted by the man I despised most, and I would make him pay. I would make both of them pay. I did not sleep that night. Evelyn lay beside me, curled away, her breathing unsteady. I stared at the ceiling, my mind unraveling the past 20 years, trying to separate truth from illusion. How long had she known? How many times had I kissed her, held her without realizing she carried another man's secret inside her? How many times had I looked into the eyes of my children, and mistaken their resemblance for mine? At dawn, I left the house without a word. The academy grounds were quiet, the first rays of morning light spilling through the iron gates. For years, this place had been my sanctuary, a world I had crafted with discipline and purpose. Now, it felt like a mausoleum. I walked the length of the empty halls, the weight of history pressing down on me. Portraits of past headmasters lined the walls. Stoic, dignified men who had carried the Thorn name through generations, and now I was the fraud among them. A thorn in name, but nothing more. By the time I reached my office, I had made my decision. Alistair would pay. I would not let him live as the secret father of my children, staining the Thorn bloodline with his existence. I sat at my desk, smoothing the creases in my jacket, forcing my hands to be steady. Then I picked up the phone. Alistair, we need to talk. Alistair arrived that afternoon, his usual air of smugness radiating from every movement. He stepped into my office without knocking, the scent of his expensive cologne filling the room. His graying hair was neatly combed, his tailored suit flawless. To anyone else, he looked like a distinguished scholar. To me, he was the man who had stolen everything. Silas, he said smoothly, lowering himself into the chair across from me. What an unexpected call. I forced myself to meet his eyes. We have unfinished business. He smiled, tilting his head. Oh? And what business would that be? I slid the genealogy report across the desk. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply glanced at the document, as if I had handed him a student's poorly written thesis. Then, slowly, he exhaled and set it back down. I assume Evelyn finally told you, he said, his voice maddeningly calm. I clenched my fist beneath the desk. You ruined my family. Alistair raised a brow. I created your family. A hot, violent rage surged through me, but I swallowed it down. You manipulated her, I said. You used your influence, your position. She made choices, Alistair interrupted. Perhaps ones she regrets now, but let's not pretend she was an unwilling participant. I stood so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. You forced her into this. Alistair sighed, as if the conversation bored him. Silas, you always did have a weakness for absolutes. The world isn't as simple as good and evil, right and wrong. History, true history, is written in shades of gray. I gritted my teeth. You're a monster. And you, he said, standing slowly, buttoning his coat, are a man with a broken legacy. Tell me, what do you plan to do about it? I stared at him. I had thought about this moment all day. Imagined throwing a punch, shattering that smug expression. But that was too easy. No, Alistair needed to be destroyed in a way that mattered, and I had already begun to plan. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at me with something close to amusement. You know, he mused, you should be thanking me. Without me, you'd have no children at all. Then he was gone. I sat back down, the room spinning around me. The fire inside me was no longer anger. It was something colder, something final. Evelyn had betrayed me first. Alistair had stolen my legacy. I would return the favor. In blood, the weeks that followed were filled with silence. Evelyn and I barely spoke. She moved through the house like a ghost, her presence familiar yet distant. She still made breakfast for the children, still folded their clothes, still tucked them into bed. But when the house was quiet, when the night pressed in around us, she sat on the edge of our bed, staring at nothing. I never told her that I had confronted Alistair. She didn't ask. I knew she carried her own guilt, the weight of years, spent keeping a secret she never wanted to bear. But guilt was not enough. She had destroyed our family just as much as Alistair had, and now she would face the consequences. Murder is an art. Violence is sloppy. It invites suspicion. It forces men to look for explanations, to ask questions that should never be answered. But an accident is a tragedy. An unfortunate moment that leaves nothing behind but grief. I knew Evelyn's routine. She walked the garden path every evening, rain or shine, a quiet moment she took for herself. The stone pathway was old, uneven. We had always meant to repair. Yet no one would question a fall, a misplaced step, a broken neck, a widow left to mourn. One night, after she had gone to bed, I stepped outside with a hammer and chisel. I worked in silence, loosening the stones beneath the path, shifting them just enough. Then I waited. It happened just as I had planned. She walked the garden path at dusk, the autumn wind rustling the branches. I watched from the window, waiting for the moment her foot found the loose stone. It took only a second. Her body twisted, arms flailing, a cry of surprise cutting through the air. She hit the ground hard, the sound of impact sharp against the quiet evening. I waited. No movement. Stepped outside, my heart pounding with something I didn't recognize. Victory? Relief? She lay still, her head at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled beneath her, darkening the earth. I knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Nothing. It was over. I played the grieving husband well. The doctors confirmed a broken skull, internal bleeding. An unfortunate accident, a misstep on an old path. The town mourned. The academy sent flowers. The children clung to me, their little hands tight around my arms, seeking comfort in their father. But my mind was already elsewhere. Evelyn's death was just the beginning. Alistair was next. The funeral was held on a cold, gray morning. Evelyn's casket sat beneath the church's arched ceiling, surrounded by white lilies. The children sat beside me, their faces pale, their grief raw. I played my part perfectly. Head bowed, shoulders heavy with sorrow, my hands trembling just enough to look real. The whispers had already begun. Such a tragedy. Such a devoted husband. How will he go on? I kept my face unreadable. I had always been a man of control, and this was no different. My grief was expected, my suffering inevitable. No one questioned a grieving husband who barely spoke, who stared at the ground as if the weight of his loss was too great to bear. But inside, I was calm, because Evelyn was gone. And now, it was Alistair's turn. I sent the letter 2 days after the funeral. Meet me at Stonemore Ruins, we need to talk. No name, no signature, just the place, the time. He would know who it was from. Stonemore was an old historical site just outside of town, an abandoned manor, its walls crumbling, its foundations swallowed by ivy. It had once been the pride of our family, a relic of the Thorne legacy. Now it was nothing but ruins. Fitting, I thought, that it would be the last place Alistair would ever see. He arrived just before dusk. The ruins loomed behind him, jagged stone and twisted iron gates casting long shadows. He walked toward me with slow, measured steps, his face unreadable. "You've lost weight," he said casually, as if this were a family gathering and not a reckoning. I said nothing. He took a long breath, tilting his head. Evelyn's death tragic, I was sorry to hear it. A lie. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't sorry at all. "You did this," I said. My voice was steady, even. "You destroyed my family. You stole everything from me." Alistair sighed, as if I were a slow student failing to grasp a simple lesson. "Silas, you never had anything to begin with." I took a step forward. "You manipulated her. You used her." "She came to me," he said smoothly. "You were always too blind to see it." Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the rusted iron rod I had hidden behind the stone wall and swung. It connected with his ribs, the dull crack of bone splitting the quiet air. He staggered, gasping, his hands grasping at nothing. I hit him, again and again. He collapsed to the ground, blood staining the earth, his breaths ragged. He tried to speak, but I pressed my knee against his chest, pinning him beneath my weight. "You were never meant to be a thorn," I whispered. Then I lifted the rod one final time and brought it down. I wasn't finished. Inside the ruins, locked, away in a glass case, sat a document, the original charter of Thorne Academy, signed centuries ago by our ancestors, a symbol of our legacy. I shattered the glass. Taking a handful of Alistair's blood, I smeared it across the parchment, staining the ink, defiling the history he had tainted. The past was a lie, and now, so was its record. When the police arrived, I was waiting. They found me standing over Alistair's body, my hand still stained with blood. I did not run. I did not resist. I looked at them, my voice calm, my fate already decided. The truth has been preserved, and for the first time, in weeks I finally felt free. The interrogation room smelled like bleach and cold metal. I sat in the hard plastic chair, hands cuffed in front of me, dried blood crusted under my nails. They had taken my jacket, my tie, even my wedding ring. The only thing left was the truth, and I was finally ready to give it. Detective Warren, a broad man with tired eyes, sat across from me. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He just studied me like I was a puzzle with missing pieces. He had seen killers before, but not like me. I wasn't a man who had acted in blind rage. I was a man who had planned. "You confessed," Warren said, after a long silence. "But I want to hear it in your own words." I met his gaze. "Which part?" He sighed. "All of it." I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Evelyn first," I said. He nodded, flipping through his notes. "The coroner's report, blunt force trauma, a broken skull, initially ruled an accident." He looked up. "It wasn't, was it?" I shook my head. He didn't react. No anger, no disgust, just quiet expectation. I loosened the stones in the garden path, I admitted. I knew she walked that way every night. Warren tapped his pen against the table. "Why?" The answer came easily. "She betrayed me." A flicker of something passed over his face, pity maybe, but pity was useless now. "She didn't betray you," he said evenly. "She was trapped." I clenched my jaw. "She kept the secret," I said. "She let me believe a lie." Warren didn't argue. He let the silence settle between us before flipping to the next page. "Alistair Thorne," he said. "You planned that too." I didn't deny it. "I lured him to the ruins," I said. "I knew he wouldn't be able to resist. He liked power. He liked control. He thought I was broken." "And you killed him," Warren said. "Yes." His gaze flicked to his notes again. "Then you defaced the Academy's founding charter." "Why?" I exhaled. "Because history is a lie." Warren studied me for a long time. "You know what happens next." I nodded. Prison, trial, the inevitable verdict. I had accepted my fate the moment I raised that iron rod. Warren closed his notebook. "Any last words?" I looked him in the eye. "The truth has been preserved, and I meant it." The morning air was sharp, carrying the damp scent of autumn leaves and wet earth. Cedar Creek Academy was always still at this hour, the campus barely stirring before the first classes of the day. But today, something was wrong. The moment I stepped onto the path leading to the greenhouse, I felt it. A heaviness in the air, a silence too deep. Then I saw them. A cluster of students, pale and shivering, stood just outside the greenhouse doors. Some had their arms wrapped around themselves. Others were whispering in panicked tones. And then I spotted Officer Kane, his uniform stark against the early morning fog, standing near the entrance. As I approached, one of the students, Emma Pierce, one of Dr. Holloway's most dedicated protégés, turned to me, her face stricken. "Doctor, Holloway's in sight," she whispered. She's not moving." My stomach dropped. I had known Vivian Holloway for years. She wasn't just a professor, she was the professor. The kind of teacher who made you see the world differently. She had a way of talking about plants that made them seem like living, breathing things with thoughts of their own. I pushed past the students, stepping inside the greenhouse. The glass walls were fogged with condensation, diffusing the weak morning light. Rows of plants, rare orchids, carnivorous specimens, delicate hybrids, lined the space in neat arrangements. But my eyes didn't go to the plants. They went to the body. Vivian lay sprawled near one of the central workstations, her body partially slumped against the base of a long wooden table. Her lab coat was still crisp, her ID badge clipped neatly to the pocket. A tipped-over glass container lay beside her, its contents spilled onto the stone floor. Nearby, specialized botanical tools were scattered: clippers, scalpels, forceps, and her face. Her lips were tinged blue. A tightening sensation gripped my chest. This wasn't a heart attack. This wasn't some tragic accident. This was something else. Officer Kane cleared his throat. "We need to secure the area." I barely heard him. My eyes had locked onto something just beyond Vivian's body. The greenhouse control panel. The temperature settings had been altered. Humidity levels were increased. Someone had manipulated the environment. Vivian didn't die by chance. Someone had planned this, and I had a feeling it wasn't just about her. It was about whatever she had been working on, and whoever had wanted to stop her. By the time the forensic team arrived, the greenhouse had been sealed off, its once welcoming glass walls now a crime scene. The morning fog had burned away, replaced by the stark glare of police lights flashing across the academy grounds. I stood just outside the taped-off entrance, watching as investigators moved carefully around Vivian's body. She lay there, still and silent, as though she had simply stopped existing in the middle of her work. But the blue tinge of her lips and the unnatural stillness of her limbs told a different story. A detective I hadn't seen before approached. A tall woman with sharp eyes and a navy blue trench coat. She extended a gloved hand. "Detective Elise Hart," she said, voice firm. "You're Dr. Holloway's colleague?" I hesitated before shaking her hand. "Arthur Lindell. I teach environmental sciences." She nodded, her grip quick and impersonal. "You were the first faculty member on the scene?" I glanced back at the greenhouse. "Some of her students were here before me. They found her." Hart pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me about Dr. Holloway. Any recent conflicts? Anyone who might have wanted to harm her?" "No one," I said immediately. Then I hesitated. "At least, no one I know of." Her eyes flickered up from her notes. "Explain." I exhaled. Vivian was brilliant, passionate about her work, but she wasn't the type to make enemies. If anything, she was respected, loved even. The students adored her. The faculty admired her. "Respected," Hart repeated, tapping her pen against her notebook. "So why is she dead?" The question hung in the air between us. I didn't have an answer. An hour later, I found myself in the security office, standing beside Hart and Officer Kane as they played back the footage from the Academy's surveillance system. The timestamp in the corner read 4:37 a.m., an hour before Vivian's class was set to begin. At first, there was nothing, just the empty greenhouse, the faint glow of the environmental control panel in the dim light. Then, movement. A figure entered the frame, dressed head to toe in a hazmat suit. The bulky material obscured their body shape, and the thick rubber gloves made their movements appear stiff, unnatural. They moved with purpose, heading straight for the workstations, adjusting dials on the control panel, selecting specific vials from the storage cabinet. Then the figure turned, and there she was. Vivian. She entered from the far side of the greenhouse, pausing mid-step as she noticed the intruder. Even without sound, I could tell she was asking something, demanding an explanation. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they reached into their suit pocket and withdrew something small, something metallic. A vial? A syringe? Vivian took a step back. Her posture shifted from confusion to fear, then suddenly she collapsed. No struggle, no visible attack. She simply crumpled to the floor as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. A sharp chill ran through me. The figure didn't run, didn't panic. They simply watched for a moment, ensuring she wasn't moving. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, They adjusted the environmental controls one last time before turning and walking out. Hart paused the footage. The screen froze on the retreating figure, the reflective visor of the hazmat suit obscuring their face. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clear suspect, she murmured. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Officer Kane let out a low whistle. They knew exactly what they were doing. Hart straightened. Dr. Lindell, what was Vivian working on? I hesitated. She specialized in rare plant species, mostly toxicology studies. But her latest project, she'd been investigating a newly discovered strain of Aconitum lunaris. Hart raised an eyebrow. And in plain English, that means? Moonshade, I said. A plant so toxic that even slight exposure to its pollen can cause respiratory failure. Hart's expression darkened. And where did she keep this plant? I swallowed. In the greenhouse, I said. Right where she died. By mid-afternoon, the academy was in chaos. Students huddled in clusters, whispering theories. Professors locked their office doors. The board of trustees released a statement, calling Vivian's death a tragic accident, though no one believed it. In the faculty lounge, I sat across from Detective Hart, the scent of stale coffee filling the air between us. Whoever did this knew about her research, I said. They had access to restricted materials. They knew how to manipulate the environmental controls without triggering alarms. Hart nodded, meaning they were either a scientist or someone with close ties to one. I rubbed my temples. Her partner, Dr. Marcus Bell, is a leading toxicologist. But he was out of state. The police already cleared him. Hart tapped her pen against her knee. Anyone else with a particular interest in her work? I hesitated. There was a donor, I admitted. Some wealthy businessman funding part of her research. But she never spoke much about him. Hart's eyes sharpened. A name? I exhaled. Leonard Caldwell. She jotted it down. What about her colleagues? I ran a hand through my hair. Vivian had no real enemies, but there were rivalries, people jealous of her work, professors who resented how much attention she got. Hart leaned back. And do you? The question hit harder than I expected. Do I what? Resent her. I swallowed. No. A beat of silence. Then Hart slid a business card across the table. If you remember anything else, she said, call me. I stared at the card for a long moment. Someone had murdered Vivian Holloway, and whoever it was, they weren't finished yet. The evening after Vivian's death, Cedar Creek Academy felt different. Even the air had changed, thicker, heavier, as if the place itself knew something had been lost. The usual chatter of students in the courtyard had faded into hushed whispers. The faculty moved in slow, uncertain steps, as if expecting another tragedy to strike. I sat in my office staring at the security footage Detective Hart had left me with. The grainy video looped over and over, the hazmat-clad figure moving with eerie precision, manipulating the controls, standing over Vivian's collapsing body. And then, the moment that haunted me the most, the way they watched her, not panicked, not hurried, just waiting. Whoever they were, they had wanted to see her die. I rewound the footage, pausing on the figure's posture, trying to analyze anything. Height, body type, something familiar. But the suit made everything indistinct. Then I remembered something. The SUV Detective Hart had mentioned it in passing, a dark-colored vehicle seen leaving the academy grounds shortly after Vivian's estimated time of death. The security cameras on campus hadn't caught the license plate, but maybe, just maybe, there was another angle. I pulled up the academy's secondary security feed, the cameras stationed at the east gate, the back entrance. And there it was. Black SUV, headlights cutting through the misty morning. No plates visible, but something else caught my attention. The way the driver sat, rigid, straight-backed, like someone accustomed to maintaining control. I had seen that posture before. Grabbed my phone and dialed Detective Hart. She answered on the second ring. Lindell, I need to talk to you. Now. Hart met me at a quiet cafe off campus. She was dressed in the same navy trench coat, a coffee in one hand and her ever-present notebook in the other. She got straight to the point. "You found something?" I slid my laptop across the table, the paused security footage still on the screen. "The SUV," I said. "Look at the way the driver sits. That posture. It's someone used to authority, someone who expects to be in control." Hart studied, the image, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You have someone in mind." I exhaled. "Leonard Caldwell," her eyebrows raised. "Vivian's research donor?" "More than that," I said. She never talked about him much, but I know he was pushing her to speed up her work. He had a particular interest in her latest project, the Moonshade strain. Hart jotted something down. "You think he wanted it for himself?" I shook my head. "I think he wanted her out of the way." She leaned forward. "Any reason why?" I hesitated. "A few weeks ago, Vivian mentioned something, offhand, but it stuck with me. She said she was considering cutting ties with a certain donor, that she was uneasy about his intentions." Hart tapped her pen against the table. "And you didn't think that was relevant before?" I exhaled sharply. "I didn't know she was going to be murdered," she sighed, flipping her notebook closed. "All right, Caldwell's a businessman, but he's also private. Getting information on him won't be easy." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Hart took a sip of her coffee. "Leonard Caldwell doesn't officially exist." I stared at her. "What?" She pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. No tax records, no property in his name, no employment history, just business transactions under shell companies. The man operates in shadows. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. Vivian had been dealing with someone far more dangerous than I'd thought, and now she was dead. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the scattered research papers I had borrowed from Vivian's office before the academy locked it down. Her notes on Moonshade were meticulous. She had been analyzing its properties, documenting how even a trace amount of pollen could shut down the nervous system within minutes. Then I found something. A highlighted passage, her handwriting sharp in the margins. "Potential for weaponization. Need to be cautious about applications." My breath caught. Vivian had realized something. She had figured out what Caldwell wanted. And that's why she had to die. I grabbed my phone and called Detective Hart. It rang. And rang. No answer. Then a single text from an unknown number flashed on my screen. "Stop asking questions." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. Someone was watching, and I had just moved up on their list. The text said on my screen, the letters sharp and final. "Stop asking questions." I stared at it, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Who had sent it? Caldwell? Someone working for him? Was I already being watched? I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. Panic was useless. I needed to think. I dialed Detective Hart again, straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. By midnight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My apartment had always been a place of comfort. Bookshelves stacked with research, a worn-out couch that had seen too many late nights, the soft hum of the heater kicking on. But tonight the air felt different. Thicker. Like someone had been here. I did a slow walk through my place, checking the locks, making sure the windows were still latched. Everything seemed untouched. But then I saw it. A single piece of paper on my kitchen counter. I hadn't left it there. With hesitant fingers, I picked it up. It was an old photograph, grainy, black and white. A greenhouse, eerily similar to the one on campus. But this one was older, its glass streaked with dirt, overgrown vines twisting around its frame. I flipped it over. A date was scrawled on the back. October 27, 1974. Almost 50 years ago to the day. And beneath it 3 words. History repeats itself. My throat went dry. Who the hell had left this? The next morning, I went straight to the Academy archives. The librarian, an older woman named Miriam, raised an eyebrow as I approached. You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a smile. Just chasing one. She chuckled, leading me to the records room. Anything in particular? I handed her the photograph. Do we have any records of a greenhouse on campus back in the 70s? Miriam adjusted her glasses, studying the image. Oh, that was the old botanical research lab. It was torn down decades ago. I frowned. Why? She hesitated. I'm not sure, but I can check. She disappeared into the shelves and I waited, my foot tapping anxiously. Minutes passed before she returned carrying a dusty file. This is all we have. I opened it, scanning faded newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. Then my eyes landed on a name. Dr. Elias Caldwell. I stiffened. Caldwell. I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening. Dr. Elias Caldwell had been a researcher at Cedar Creek Academy in the early 1970s, studying toxic plant derivatives, the same field as Vivian. The articles mentioned an experiment gone wrong, something about a contaminated strain that had resulted in unfortunate consequences. But there were no details, no specifics, just vague implications that whatever happened had been covered up, and then a final note in red ink written decades ago. Project terminated, facility decommissioned, all records sealed. My heart pounded. Vivian had been researching something dangerous. Caldwell had wanted it. And now, 50 years later, another Caldwell had come back to finish what was started. I needed to find Detective Hart. I drove to the police station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Hart was a seasoned detective. She wouldn't just ignore calls. She wouldn't just disappear. But when I reached the station, I knew something was wrong. Her desk was empty, cleared out. No files, no notes, nothing. I approached the officer at the front desk. I need to speak with Detective Hart. The man gave me a blank look. Who? I blinked. Detective Elise Hart. She's handling the Holloway case. The officer frowned. We don't have a Detective Hart. My stomach turned. That's not possible. He shook his head. You sure you have the right department? I took a step back. Hart was gone. Not reassigned. Not on leave. Gone. As if she had never existed. As if someone had erased her. I stumbled out of the station, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My head was spinning. The photograph, the text message, the missing detective. Someone was tying off loose ends. And I was next. Pulled out my phone, my hands shaking. I didn't know who else to call, who I could trust. But then, a new message appeared on my screen. No number. No sender. Just 3 words. Meet me tonight. And an address. I stared at it. I had a choice. I could walk away. Pretend I never found any of this. Let the past stay buried, or I could go, find out the truth even if it killed me. The address led me to the edge of Cedar Creek, where the town's lights faded into dense, unmarked woods. My car's headlights carved a narrow path through the trees, illuminating the cracked pavement of an abandoned road. I gripped the wheel tightly, heart hammering in my chest. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, but I had come too far. Vivian's death wasn't an accident. Detective Hart hadn't just vanished, and whoever had sent me this message knew why. I pulled up to the location, an old greenhouse, long forgotten. Its glass was shattered in places, vines creeping through the frame like nature was trying to reclaim it. The same greenhouse from the photograph. I stepped out of the car, my breath misting in the cold night air. The woods were silent, unnervingly still. Every step toward the greenhouse felt like walking into a trap. And then from the darkness, a voice. You came. I turned sharply. A figure stepped into the dim light. A man, older, his face lined, with years of something heavier than age. His suit was slightly disheveled, but his posture remained rigid. Leonard Caldwell. Vivian's mysterious donor. The ghost of a failed experiment. I swallowed hard. You sent the message. He nodded. I knew you'd keep digging. I clenched my fists. Why? Why did she have to die? Caldwell sighed, stepping closer. Dr. Holloway was brilliant, but she was reckless. She didn't understand what she was dealing with. She understood enough to know it was dangerous. His expression darkened. Exactly. I took a step forward. Tell me about 1974. A flicker of something crossed his face. Hesitation, maybe regret. My father, Elias Caldwell, led an experiment here, he admitted. He believed moonshade could be controlled, refined, a toxin capable of precise, targeted use. But the experiment went wrong. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. What happened? Caldwell's gaze flicked toward the greenhouse. Test subjects, lab animals, died instantly, a researcher too after an accidental exposure. The project was shut down, records were buried, but my father never stopped believing in the potential. I exhaled sharply. And you picked up where he left off. His jaw tightened. Doctor, Holloway's research was the closest anyone had come to unlocking the plant's secrets. But she wanted to publish her findings. She was going to expose everything. My stomach turned. So you killed her? Caldwell shook his head. No, but I had to stop her. I stepped closer. Then who? His silence told me everything. Someone higher. Someone with more to lose. Vivian had gotten too close to a secret that powerful men had kept buried for decades, and someone had silenced her for it. Caldwell exhaled, glancing around the darkened clearing. I brought you here for a reason, Dr. Lindell. I stiffened. You have a choice, he continued. You can keep digging, keep asking questions, and you'll end up like Holloway. Like Hart. My breath caught. You did have her killed. His eyes were unreadable. She knew too much. Like you do now. A long silence stretched between us. I had always thought truth mattered. That exposing the wrong people would bring justice. But as I stood there, the weight of reality sank in. The truth wouldn't save Vivian. It wouldn't bring Hart back. And if I pushed any further, it wouldn't save me either. Caldwell studied me carefully. Or, you can walk away. I stared at him. Walk away. Forget about Vivian, about the experiment, about the fact that this man, this family, had gotten away with murder. Could I live with that? I thought of Vivian's laughter, her passion for teaching, the way she spoke about her work as if plants held the answers to everything. I thought of her body, crumpled in the greenhouse, lips blue from a toxin meant to be hidden from the world. I already knew my answer. I turned toward my car, my movement slow, deliberate. Caldwell watched me go, his expression unreadable. You made the right choice, he said quietly. I didn't reply. I drove away without looking back, the dark trees swallowing the road behind me. 3 days later, a fire broke out in the Academy's greenhouse. The entire structure was destroyed along with Vivian's research. The police called it an accident. I knew better. I never told anyone what happened that night in the woods. But I still dream of Vivian, of her standing among her plants, sunlight catching in her hair, of her voice whispering through the leaves, asking me why. And I still don't have an answer.